the basic idea is that the small thing is perceived negatively, whereas if you enlarge it to a bigger scale, it is perceived as a positive, alright? And some examples might be like a small gang of bandits becomes like a big good government, you know, like a small like extremistic sect becomes like a big well-established religion, like a small pseudoscience becomes a big well-established academic science, like a small robber or crook becomes a big central bank well-established with good reputation. I mean, all of this in thick air quotes, right? Small murderer turns into a big war hero or a national leader, pretty much all of whom are like mass murderers. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I wish to talk about an interesting phenomenon, as usual, but a very particular one actually, where how the very same thing is being perceived by society very differently when it's like at different scales, like at small scale and at large scale. And more precisely, at small scale, this thing, like actually like a broad array of things, is perceived negatively, whereas when it becomes big, at large scale that is, it is perceived like either neutral or even positive, alright? And I'll give you some examples near the end of this video. And actually, maybe I'll even put them in like the preface, as I usually do. So, it's illustrated the best by the quote from this Zhuang Zhou, Chinese thinker from of a very legendary character. Of course, he probably never existed, but anyway, somebody who wrote whatever Zhuang Zhou supposedly wrote has written that, in particular, he who steals a belt, he who steals a belt buckle is executed, but he who steals a state is made a feudal lord. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like we do a bad thing on a small scale and we are perceived as like a bad person, but when we do it on a large scale, we're actually like beyond good and evil, again, like beyond judgment. We're actually becoming like again, some sort of like a hero almost, right? Like a positive person, like a feudal lord, a king or emperor or whatever, alright? So yeah, there is definitely some interesting phenomenon, which is pretty general, I would claim, which is what I've described above. So we have this almost proverbial, you know, too big to fail type of situation where like the malevolence of big institutions or large groups of people is not perceived as malevolence anymore, and it is almost perceived as as at least a given, or at best even like a benefactory influence on society or something like that, right? Like when even though it is plainly obvious that things that hold society together, like all these big institutions, like big banks, for example, they come from pretty dirty sources, alright? We kind of have to let them be, alright? Because again, otherwise the society wouldn't exist, at least in the form that we know it in, right? Something like that. So, if we start to dig in deeper, perhaps into some sort of psychological explanations for such a situation, then we'll see that, yeah, again, for some reason, alright, we aren't against being abused by something big and powerful, right? So big things have good reputation almost by default for some reason, again. Not all of them, though, of course. Like some big things actually have pretty bad reputation, so there are exceptions for sure. But overall, there is, again, what I've called presumption of competence, right? In my video named Presumption of Competence. See the link in the description where I say that like a large institution or a large group of people for some reason like has this innate value in it, like innate authority just by virtue of being large or big. I don't know if that's a proper word here. So we arrive at this Quod licet Jovi non licet bovi, you know, this proverb, which it's, by the way, not it hasn't been proven that it's like a genuine ancient Latin proverb, because the first time, like well-established time it actually appears is like 19th century. All right, but anyway, what it means is that gods can do what cattle cannot, or may. Gods may do what cattle may not. So, you know, what these guys can do, these guys cannot. So big guys can afford do all these malevolent things while little guys cannot, you know, something like that. So a big crook is actually already so big that he's not even a crook anymore, you know, something like that. Which, by the way, illustrates the genesis of all the aristocracy and elites in general in the world. Which is basically from dirt and filth, right? In moral sense, among others. So all these like aristocratic families come from like 16th century pirates, crooks, counterfeit, how do you call it, forgers, I don't know, killers, and I don't know, hookers and whatnot. Mostly, not necessarily. Of course, there is like this warrior aristocracy, right? Etc., etc. Of course, you might say, well, in a free world, I would say, at least as a libertarian, like on a free market, you would have like the elites emerging naturally because they produce something that people actually need, and people thus, you know, pay them money. By the way, watch my video, Money is Information. Is it called Money is Information? Or What is Money? I'll link it anyway. Where I say that, yeah, basically, if you have a lot of money, it means, on a free market, I repeat, it means that people actually needed what you produced, and therefore they gave you this money in exchange for whatever you've produced. But obviously, we haven't really had a free market pretty much never in history, and we don't have it today for sure. Thus, the elites actually appear through different channels other than that. All right, some of which I've already named. Okay, so the best explanation I have for it, for this phenomenon that I've described, is actually rather abstract, I would say, but nevertheless, I'm going to give it to you. So, like again, a very abstract, very dry and philosophical, if you wish. So the reason is the very nature of judgment. So what we're dealing with here with this phenomenon is like, how do we judge whether something is bad when it's small or good when it's big, all right? So the very nature of judgment, therefore, is under question with regards to this phenomenon at the very least. And the point I'm making is that any judgment must have an arbiter, right? Must have a subject which produces the judgment, following their own values, whatever they are. And the problem, or rather like the explanation of the phenomenon I've described above, is, in this, through these lenses, so to speak, is that the largest crimes, for example, simply don't have anything above them. Like there is no arbiter big enough to judge them as crimes. And therefore, like, if you have like a tribe, for example, and one person from this tribe like steals from another person, well, a tribe has like a leader, how do you call it, a chieftain or whatever, and it's like the tribe is like maybe, I don't know, a few hundred people. And they can judge this person because the person is so small with respect to the tribe and its inherent hierarchy, all right? But if the tribe itself commits a crime, well, who can judge? Well, only somebody who is bigger than the tribe. For example, like there is already like a confederation of tribes existing, all right? And one of the tribes sort of misbehaved, like they've invaded the neighboring tribe's territory, and the confederacy says thus, okay, guys, this is against our laws, you are bad, therefore. Therefore, this is a crime already by virtue of being judged by this confederation or its council or whatever. And you see the analogy, right? But when we're going to the level of such big crimes that there is nothing above them, like let's say the national state commits crimes, like war crimes or crimes against their own people, for example, Well, there's basically no one to judge. Of course, we have like supposedly, hypothetically, like supranational institutions, like such as United Nations, etc., etc. But in reality, they have zero power, right? They cannot really do anything, and therefore, even their judgment is like a joke, actually, right? So yeah, so countries may commit crimes, therefore, like illustrate this quote from Zhuang Zhou. You know, thick air quotes, that, yeah, if you steal a belt buckle, you would be executed, but if you steal a whole country, you would become its leader, right? Essentially. Like, there's no one to judge you for that, essentially, because you are the judge, ultimately, right now, right? Yeah. Well, but this is basically the idea. And yeah, we can delve again into this topic, like what comes after national states. Again, I'll reiterate my point, which is not actually my point, but I agree with it, that national states are gonna decline pretty quickly, pretty soon, and then we'll have like what is called civilization states, roughly speaking, like European Union, roughly speaking North America, roughly speaking China, roughly speaking India, etc., etc. And only then, on the next stage, maybe like 100 or 200 years after, we'll come to the stage of like a global, you know, concentration camp, global government. And it would probably already be at the stage when we'll inhabit other celestial bodies, not only Earth. I mean, yeah, like 100 years ago, probably people were saying the same things, but I mean, I don't know. Let's be optimistic, all right? Yeah. So, well, let me give you a couple of examples. So, again, the basic idea is that the small thing is perceived negatively, whereas if you enlarge it to a bigger scale, it is perceived as a positive, alright? And some examples might be like a small gang of bandits becomes like a big, good government, you know, like a small, like extremistic sect becomes like a big well-established religion, like a small pseudoscience becomes a big well-established academic science, like a small robber or crook becomes a big central bank well-established with good reputation. I mean, all of this in thick air quotes, right? Small murderer turns into a big war hero or a national leader, pretty much all of whom are like mass murderers, like without even air quotes, both explicitly and implicitly. Again, speaking about externalities, when I'm talking about implicitly, not even talking about like explicitly when we're talking about wars, and stuff. Or a small bad artist, I mean, the artist who kind of violated the rules, right, becomes a big, like genius who have established a completely new genre, you know? So yeah, you can see the pattern, right? Like it's very clear. And this is pretty much what I'm talking about. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about. And yeah, in my opinion, like the basic premise of it is like this purely mechanistic, realization is rational, but realization that purely mechanistically, the nature of judgment is such that you have to have an arbiter to have a judgment. And for some crimes, there is no arbiter because they are so big, they just overwhelm, like, you know, the situation. So you can't really judge them. You can judge them like by yourself, like, you know, as a person, you might say, well, this is bad, what is happening? But there's really no one to actually like condemn it as such, right? And by no one, I literally mean no one. There's no such like subject of capable of any sort of action, all right? Or at least any sort of like acknowledged action, which would be proper in this sort of sense. All right, like I thought about like talking about some vaguely related things, but I think it's already good as it is, what I've said. Actually, let me just mention very briefly some of the things I thought about while like preparing for this video. Like, for example, like again, what I've already mentioned, like the artist who creates a new genre, right? He basically, like, inside of a genre, he's like a bad artist because he violates whatever. But when he is already considered as something big, as a genius, then we might tolerate it already, right? We might say, okay, he's a genius, let him do whatever he wants, all right? The Quod, licet, Jovi. Like, he's a god level, we cannot judge him anymore. And actually, what Nietzsche says is that, like, this is the common thing with geniuses, right? Why do we call somebody a genius and, like, don't feel bad about it, like, feeling inferior with respect to them, is because, again, we call them a genius and we sort of isolate them. We say, okay, these are not really human beings, you know, in some sense. I am a normal human being, but I don't have to compete with geniuses. Like, they are a whole other breed. Let them, like, we'll judge them separately. So again, a person who is, like, bad at piano in some weird way is considered to be a person who is bad at piano, but like a very famous person who is bad at piano is considered like having their own style, you know, something like that. All right. Or God in Christianity is another example. Like, the God is above everything, and therefore he can judge like everything pretty much, right? That's, by the way, like, it's this process of invention of a next scale, right? Like, I've given this example many times before, like when early Christians, basically what they've said is that, okay, you have the power of the Caesar, right, or the hierarchy of the Roman Empire. Well, guess what? We have a completely different but much larger hierarchy, which is centered on God, right? So your Caesar is so small with respect to our God. It's actually, our God is gonna be a judge over your Caesar, right? So your Caesar might be considered as a criminal, even though in your hierarchy, there's no one to judge your Caesar because the Caesar is above everyone else, right? So it's another illustration of the point I'm making. Yeah, and speaking of morality, like, again, when we're making a judgment, it's always by necessity a moral judgment, right? Because it's a value-oriented judgment, so we're talking about either good or bad. But this very same phenomenon illustrates that morality really only exists up to a certain threshold. So when basically there's no one to judge whether something is moral or not, like there's no one above some phenomenon, this phenomenon becomes like immoral in the sense, not in the sense like against morals, but in the sense like beyond morals, right? Beyond morality. So at some level, the power structures which like just collide and like fight for resources and like, I don't know, consume each other or give birth to each other or whatever, like this blind struggle of theirs cannot even be described in the sense of morality, on the language of morality, if you wish, because again, there's simply no other power structure above them to make such a judgment in the first place. So morality is a tool to be projected downwards. It's a tool of control, ultimately, right? Morality is a beautiful servant and a dangerous master, you know. And another thing I thought about, and it's like a complete PS with respect to this video, is density in nature. Like, I literally thought about it a few days ago, how it seems like, well, when we're talking about scales, right? Different scales of things. So in nature, it seems like the density of everything, pretty much energy, mass, etc., etc. The density seems to decrease with scale, right? It seems like a very universal law. So, you know, like small particles have the largest density. Of course, in our modern retarded interpretation of quantum mechanics, we have point-like particles which technically have infinite density, right? Again, see my video, what was it? Beyond the Border, where I talk about these artifacts, mathematical artifacts such as infinite density, black holes, etc., etc., and how exactly they appear and why they shouldn't appear, but they do, because of the retardation of modern science. So yeah, the density seems to decrease with increase of scale, right? So the total volume and the total energy increases, but the density decreases. That's kind of an interesting phenomenon. So particles have largest density, then like physical bodies have like smaller density, but still like noticeable, at least by human standards. And then like larger objects have almost like super small density, and like the observable part of the universe has like almost zero density, right? Something like that. Yeah. And well, I kind of want to talk about the scalability of plasma, you know, this famous thing from the electric universe. But I'll just link my own post in the description, my own forum post, where I specifically discuss the scalability of plasma with regards to Sapphire project. All right, and also see my video. Basically, my point there is that the scalability they're working with is wrong. Like they're scaling their experiment in the wrong way. So it might be like analogous to what we might observe somewhere in space, but in terms of like pure energy, like electric and magnetic fields, for example, it is wrong the way they scale their experiment. But again, see the details in the post, and also watch my video, Does Electromagnetism Work in Space? I'll also link it in the description. All right. Yeah, so we talked about this interesting phenomenon where okay, that's kind of a tautology, where a small bad deed is perceived as bad deed, but a large bad deed is perceived as like either neutral or even a good deed. Basically, that's what this video is about. And like, it's about the difference in perception of something necessitated, I don't know, the difference which arises due to differences in scale. Let's put it this way. All right. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.